there's one thing that's a common sentiment among visual novel fans, is that the vast majority of anime adaptations are not very good because they tend to rush through things, leave out narration, and given the way anime airs its seasons, will likely only maybe cover one route. The community tends to only universally praise a few visual novel to anime adaptations. However, I find that, on average, I tend to like anime adaptations well enough as long as they adapt the story well enough for what they're covering, and as long as they're not just doing completely anime original content without feeling like it has the spirit of what the original visual novel was going for. So in this video, I'm going to rank every visual novel to anime adaptation I've watched up to this point. Just keep in mind, I'm going to rank the anime based on a mix of how much I liked the show on its own merits, along with how it adapts the source material. I'll just be upfront with this though. There are many of these anime where I've not read the original visual novel, so I don't have a point of comparison. In case anyone asks, with a few very notable exceptions, I'm not going to talk about anime adaptations of Nukige because I'd rather focus on visual novels that are at least trying to tell a story beyond sex. The Majikoi anime is probably not objectively the worst anime adaptation. It technically covers a whole arc, has a plot, and the characters on paper at least have the basic building blocks of the setting in the series. However, on a personal level, I hate it. The first grave sin is how, for some reason, it takes place after Momoyo's bad ending in the original visual novel, with literally the first episode being a super Cliff Notes version of all the coolest moments that happened in her route during the Kawakami War. Then the rest of the series becomes this weird, generic harem ecchi anime where all 5 main heroines act weirdly out of character, being much more overtly interested in Yamato, something that never happened in the VN ever besides Miyako, of course. And then it tries to pull some ghetto version of the Agave route where the Itagakis and Shakuro were hoarding porn magazines and Takai who got robot arms for some reason. So yeah, this anime just did so many things wrong, from the characterization to a boring plot to being anime original content that barely felt like it had the comedy style of the original VN, besides some minor callbacks. To most anime-only watchers, this is probably just some generic slop that just felt like any other ecchi anime from that time period. But for me, this is easily the most disappointing visual novel to anime adaptation because they could have just made this an adaptation of the original visual novel's common route, which is already pretty long with plenty of content to cover, and actually highlight the friendship themes that are important to the Majikoi universe. But this anime basically almost never does that, despite the characters technically being around each other all the time. The Kara no Shoujo anime is 100% not good at all. It's literally a 2-episode hentai OVA that very vaguely gives a glimpse of what the plot is even about, focusing on 2 H scenes, one that's only kind of important to the plot and very vaguely references the main plot but literally does nothing with it. I get that with KNS that in addition to some mature dark bloody murders, the sex is technically important to the plot, but reducing this classic title by Innocent Grey to a boring hentai OVA, in my opinion, it just does a bad job of enticing people to actually read the original visual novel. The actual sex scenes from the VN aren't exactly the greatest to begin with, so they don't exactly translate well in hentai form either. There is a similar issue with the Cartagra hentai OVA, which basically follows the exact same 2-episode format. However, at least the Cartagra anime kind of attempts to adapt the first half of Cartagra's story proper. The second episode at least reveals who the first real villain of the original visual novel was, and has Shugo getting it on with a few brothel girls, is at least fitting and unique for a hentai adaptation. But otherwise, if you're watching this for a story, definitely do not. The Clannad movie adaptation is definitely not a good way to enjoy this take on the original visual novel. When we literally have a 50-episode series that does a much better job, this movie adaptation just feels like a weird cash grab attempt that takes a lot of strange liberties, like changing Nagisa's personality to some overly wholesome, angelic girl instead of the flawed girl who had to go through a lot of development and heartbreak. It technically gets some beats of the original visual novel right, kinda sorta at times, but for the most part, it's just literally all over the place. I can't imagine an anime-only person understanding what's even going on, with little to no context of the build-up and dramatic scenes. The Tsukihime anime is considered one of the absolute worst visual novel adaptations for good reason, to the point that people make an, in my opinion, really unfunny, overused meme that it doesn't exist. Now, I'm not going to defend this anime and say it's great, or good, or hell, even decent. It does a lot of weird things, like basically doing a half-assed version of Arcueud's route, kind of including content from other routes, and wasting time with random filler episodes. The art style for it just feels off, even for a DEEN adaptation. However, in my opinion, I think this adaptation at least does one thing right, gets the feel of the visual novel, being a horror-ish visual novel at times with how suspenseful it is with all the vampires and such. They also at least generally get the drama about Arcueud wanting to be seen as human, despite her being one of the most powerful characters in the series, but otherwise, yeah, this is definitely far from the ideal way to be exposed to the Tsukihime series. If I were to be quote-unquote objective, the Rance 01 hentai anime adaptation is easily the best hentai adaptation in terms of what it seems to adapt, which to be fair isn't saying much since most hentai anime VNs are just random nukige or horrible adaptations like the Cartagra or Kanon Shoujo ones as previously stated. Despite the fact that Rance is a series that has a lot of gameplay, I think the anime did a good job showing the relatively fucked up world of the first Rance game, or I guess the remake of it, and a surprisingly rich world despite this being the first entry in the series. Sadly, the main thing holding this anime back for me is I really don't like Rance as a character at all. It always surprises me how many fans he has despite being a rapist, and apparently people seem to be entertained by his obnoxiously cocky attitude. Some even excuse his behavior just because there are quote-unquote more evil characters in this universe. Can't say I cared for most of the other characters that I saw in Rance 1 either. Oh well, at least Syl was cute in this anime, I guess. Daitoshokan no Hitsujikai is an anime adaptation that's the epitome of mediocrity. I keep forgetting that I watched it. I already wasn't exactly the biggest fan of the original visual novel. I thought the character cast outside of Kanasuke was really boring, the attempted humor wasn't that good, and in general it was just really slow, especially in the common route where I just did not care about the activities the club was doing. The anime adaptation at least went faster and got to the, I guess we can call secret twist, the importance of the titular library, but ultimately it was just an aimless anime adaptation that didn't really have an ending. But I guess at least it got the characterization of the characters right, and seemed to hint at some of the route's drama, which I guess was nice. The Baldr Force anime is one I watched even before knowing it was a visual novel, especially before knowing it was by Giga, who made the generally more popular Baldr Sky, which is the only Baldr visual novel I've read to this date. Regardless, I can only judge Baldr Force as an anime only. I never read the fan translation of Force since it just felt like a less interesting and less fun gameplay-wise version of Baldr Sky. But even when I watched the anime back in the day, it still felt like the anime was clearly skipping around. I felt like I barely got to know the characters, though a few did seem pretty cool or interesting. That said, I will say, the anime did a decent enough job to get me interested in this sci-fi world that was clearly being set up with a lot of depth, since it had a lot of mysteries and a lot of clear plot reveals. Unfortunately, since the Baldr Force anime was about the length of a movie, I basically had no emotional investment, so I just thought this anime was okay at best. It's interesting that for the longest time, Utawarerumono was one of the few anime adaptations that didn't seem to get a lot of hate, and was even kind of nostalgic for people. That said, I tried to watch this multiple times back when it first aired way back in the early 2010s, but I just couldn't get into it. I only finished it in 2025. If there's any story I can think of that's literally the definition of okay at best, it's the original Utawarerumono anime adaptation. I like the idea of it, a main character with a mysterious past and amnesia. Okay, the amnesia part's kinda lame, but having him taken in by a small village and him slowly becoming a strong war leader, leading wars against other countries, befriending other people, and getting allies and stuff seemed interesting. However, on a personal level, I just thought the way the characters moved to fighting different factions just felt really rushed to the point I just didn't care about anything. Whenever new situations would come up or new allies or villains would appear, I just didn't care. I also thought the main recurring characters were just okay. There are thankfully only maybe 2 characters that annoyed me, but conversely, I didn't really love any of the characters. They all fulfilled their roles and that's pretty much it. It generally felt like a quantity over quality cast. I was hoping this anime would get me interested in playing Prelude to the Fallen, but if anything, it made me less interested. Apparently people say the original VN has better slice of life, but I thought the slice of life in the anime was kind of boring, because as said, I just thought the characters themselves were okay, and the joke gags were mostly whatever. Island by Frontwing has always been one of those visual novels that a few people hyped up in my visual novel Discord. However, I was always a little hesitant to try it myself, as I've heard about some of the weird stuff that happens, both in terms of the age of the characters and some of the twists. So I decided to watch the anime version instead, which in a way kind of confirmed my expectations of what I thought Island would be, just in a likely rushed 12-episode format. Basically, it's some kind of weird mystery sci-fi slice-of-life drama story that takes place on an island, big surprise. I think the character arcs for the original main 3 heroines are interesting enough, and the final arc, Never Island, had a potentially interesting setting that could have carried its own story. Unfortunately, while those elements are interesting individually, there are a lot of things about the Island anime that brought down my overall enjoyment. First of all, the main character, Setsuna, clearly has a huge age gap with the other heroines. Even if the original wasn't an eroge, there's still likely implied sex from at least one couple. Also, the fact that Setsuna has amnesia is such an overused trope, and I'll have more to say about that later. Second, the main heroines are not unlikable, but they're not ones I particularly cared about. As I said earlier, their drama is interesting, but ultimately, I didn't really care that much since I didn't think the heroines' personalities were particularly memorable. I think it says something when the best girl was likely Rine's mom, Kuon, a mostly side character. Third, there are some plot twists that are just a little too out there for me. That's the problem when the story goes from slice of life romance with character drama to a sci-fi mystery. The twists and real revelations in Island are just a little too weird for me, and it kind of made me not take the rest of the plot seriously, even though, as I said, the character arcs and the final arc were technically interesting on their own. Ultimately, this just led to a show I have very mixed feelings about. In addition to it likely being a very rushed version of the VN, the idea of the anime attempting to get you into the original source material did not work for me on this case. I did hear the anime original ending was a supposedly better conclusion than the original VN one though. The Chaos Head anime is generally considered one of the worst anime adaptations, and generally one even anime-only viewers tend to not like for multiple reasons. Naturally, a main sticking point is the fact that the main character, Takumi, is an extremely hit or miss in terms of people liking him. He is a very clearly flawed on purpose protagonist, which is a blessing and a curse in a way. On one hand, he can be a bit too darkly relatable for some people, or be too unrelatable with how much of a shut-in coward he is, but it could also be interesting to see him grow despite all the fucked up shit that was going on and how he's clearly trying to avoid it, until he can't. As far as it being an adaptation goes, I actually never finished the visual novel. I thought it was way too slow, did a really bad job of making me care for any of the characters, and the Dempa mystery stuff was something that I thought the sequel, Chaos Child, did a lot better. Basically, the only reason I even finished the Chaos Head anime is because, for better or for worse, it's a lot faster pace. It does sadly mean the Dempa stuff is lost in the anime because you don't have the delusion trigger system like in the original VN. But I would say, for the most part, Takumi freaking out and having just enough narration can get me through the story. The fact that the Chaos Head anime had decent enough animation for its time makes it so the spoilery fights later on were a little bit more appealing. But overall, the story is just okay at best, and the anime itself is also just okay. Clearly going a bit too fast, but I'll take that over being too slow and me not really caring about the characters in the actual visual novel. The anime adaptation of Mashiro Ito's Symphony is an interesting one. I think on paper it's pretty good. The first half of the series is a pretty faithful adaptation of the common route, showing how the co-ed school merges with the previously all-girls school and all the melodrama around ATRI coming around to accept the merger, and the main friend group finding out she's secretly poor was done pretty well. The interesting aspect comes in the second half of the anime, which purely covers Miyu's route from the original visual novel, which to me felt like a strange choice since ATRI was clearly written as the true heroine. However, clearly the reason they went with Miyu's route is because they knew that the most popular heroine in the series was actually Sana, who got the highest amount of screen time and development in Miyu's route in the original VN before Sana got her own route. Unfortunately, I do not like Sana at all. Miyu's route was supposedly the route that got people to like Sana, but I don't know if it's just my bias against tsunderes, but I thought the attempted development and melodrama around the new love triangle with Sana and Shingo was just kind of forced and lame. Miyu herself was a decently likable enough heroine, but the fact that we had to split time between her drama with her pets alongside the much less likable Sana heavily dropped my opinion on the anime from good or decent to just okay. The ATRI My Dear Moments anime seems to have gotten okay at best reception from both the visual novel crowd and the anime only crowd. That is likely because ATRI is a completely linear, 10-ish hours visual novel, so it's easier to adapt into one season. That said, I have heard criticisms like how they removed certain details about Natsuki's backstory and that the ending was condensed to be more positive. However, I did not read the original visual novel because it just didn't seem like a particularly groundbreaking or original VN, especially since I've read stuff like Konosora or Miyazora from Konoasta, the same writer as ATRI. ATRI is mostly this low because while I think it's a competently made robot girl story with some emotional moments and character development here and there, I think ultimately it's very by the book, to where I personally think it's probably better if it's one of your first anime or first visual novels you ever experience. I think ultimately, while the setting is interesting, with some of the characters also interesting, the story just goes on a bit too long with padded out slice of life and very predictable nakige beats. If this series had been a streamlined 2-hour movie in the vein of something like Planetarian, I probably would have liked it more. But as it stands, it's an enjoyable enough show because of some amusing and wholesome moments, but just a little bit inconsistent and messy to be higher. The 9-9 anime is kind of a weird one to talk about. I'll admit, I have not read the original visual novels yet, but after doing some research, I noticed what the anime did was basically just focus only on the plot reveals and cut out the majority of the character-focused slice of life and comedy. On one hand, this made it so the 13-episode anime of 9-9 was completely streamlined, plot-wise. That means you can get the gist of the main plot without having to go through what many could call padded-out romance and comedy, especially since you are forced to romance 4 heroines to see the whole story. Having the chuuni magic action stuff be animated, even if the animation was pretty average, was pretty nice to see. However, the trade-off is in the anime, you don't have much time to get attached to the characters. The first 3 to 4 episodes are for building up the romance for Miyako, which is done okay, but is basically glossed over for the rest of the series, transitioning to weird, fragmented development for Sora, Haruka, and Noah, which feels a bit too jarring and not properly built up. So basically, while I thought the Majikoi mystery story was done well enough, the character building and relationships left much to be desired. I just did not feel any attachment to most characters with how fast things were going. The Chaos Child anime is in a way worse than the Chaos Head anime in the sense that the Chaos Child visual novel is quite a bit longer than the Chaos Head VN, and since the Chaos Child visual novel actually has characters worth caring about, it does make the fast pacing of this story mildly frustrating at times. Keep in mind, this is a 50-ish hour visual novel, maybe 20 to 30 if we just count the common and the true ending, condensed into 13 episodes plus an OVA. That said, while the core story of the Chaos Child common route is generally preserved, it's told in a Cliff Notes style format, and with how fast things are, a lot of minor interactions are skimmed. That said, I do think it gets some of the more emotional scenes just right, and unlike Chaos Head, which hid the action scenes until much later on, the Chaos Child story had action scenes that were in the story by the midpoint of the series. I also did think some of the slice of life scenes went on a bit too long in the VN, so it was kind of nice to have them trimmed and not have to deal with the lame delusion triggered choice scenes, which were mostly completely unnecessary in Child's story. There is also a plot twist involving Nono that only shows up in her route, but got added to the common route, which is another thing I'm hit or miss on. On one hand, this is a very important plot twist, and I'm glad it was preserved since the common route is essentially the true route. However, considering how fast the anime was going, there is basically no time for Takeru to even process and break down from this twist. The one thing that ultimately makes me place the Chaos Child anime slightly higher than the Chaos Head one, despite technically being worse in a way, is the fact that I just love the OVA version of Silent Sky. Being able to see the new point of view character was a great way to really get invested, and since Silent Sky in the VN wasn't exactly super long, I think it did a good job of more or less getting the point across without skipping too much. It made the final scene, in my opinion, hit arguably harder than the visual novel version because of the visuals that you got to see. All in all, Chaos Child's anime is a mixed bag, but it slightly wins out for me in a positive way. Though admittedly a lot of it is because the original visual novel is in my top 10 favorites, I guess overall the anime was told in a somewhat competent enough way. The anime adaptation of Kimiaru, or They Are My Noble Masters, is one you may be surprised to see on this list or might not even know about. This is a particularly special series to me, as it's the first visual novel ever developed by Minatosoft, aka the same developers who made the Majikoi series. I have not read the Kimiaru visual novel because it's not translated yet, but at least watching it as an anime only, this definitely felt like a huge upgrade over whatever the Majikoi anime was. The first notable thing is that there are actual proper character introductions, like how Ren and his older sister join as butlers and maids as part of the Kuonji family. I remember the characters being decently likable and funny, none of them really stuck out that much, which is the main reason why this anime isn't higher on the list, but this anime was a decent comedy-focused title with a unique setting, with the whole butler's maid thing, made it enjoyable enough. All this anime did was make me really wish someone would translate the original visual novel already, because I'm sure it's even better. The Aokana anime is another one I have weirdly mixed feelings on, leaning towards positive by a bit. On one hand, Flying Circus was one of those things that clearly was made to be enjoyed in anime form, since the original visual novel had to rely on a lot of well-drawn still CGs to simulate animation. While I admit the anime's adaptation is just okay, relying a bit too much on competent but not spectacular CGI, I thought it did a good enough job in that regard. Now it's the character arcs where I have more mixed feelings. On one hand, I think they, for the most part, nailed the characterization of the main heroines, especially Asuka and Misaki, where the anime clearly focused a lot more on them, to the point where they put Masaya, the visual novel main character, in the back seat, which I'll talk more about later. While the first half of the anime is basically an adaptation of the common route, the second half is a weird combination of Asuka's and Misaki's routes, leaning slightly more towards Asuka's. They have some notable scenes of their character development, at least on paper, from both routes, and while some things were executed well, there were some things I knew they were trying to do, but overall, things just didn't hit. I personally was not a fan of Asuka have a similar emo arc like Misaki. I just don't think it fits her character. This might be a weird argument, but in the original visual novel, she was a Mary Sue-ish character in a way, always upbeat and positive, and never had an extremely depressed moment like Mashiro or Misaki. This caused Misaki's anime development to be less stand out because she developed a bit too fast because it relied on Asuka, who was also having basically the same development as her. And there's a shout out to Misaki's special move she only learns in her original route, but with no proper build-up, it just felt like cheap fan service with no emotional resonance. To go into a more positive argument, the Aokana anime at least embodies the spirit of Aokana, having the characters learn from their mistakes and ultimately still have fun. I still think it's emphasized very well in the final episode, which was just a beat-for-beat, well-adapted version of Asuka's final fight with Saki from her route. Easily my favorite episode in this anime. Masaya being relegated to just a coach side role with barely any of his backstory shown, nor any screen time shown how he affects any of the main heroines was a strange choice. I also think they did a really bad job emphasizing the differences of roles like speeder, fighter, and all-rounder. There's a point where Mashido has character development where she finds her real role that she finds out in her visual novel route, but in the anime, this development was rushed so it was hard to care. I wasn't sure what they were trying to do with giving Mashido spotlight outside some cute scenes where she actually still becomes friends with Rika. The anime adaptation of Kimi ga Nozomu Ein, or Kiminozo, or as it's officially localized as Rumbling Hearts, is one of the oldest anime adaptations on this list. It was produced by Studio Fantasia, which at least to me is a relatively unknown studio. I'm well aware that Kiminozo is both a Love Love prequel timeline-wise, and is basically the beta version of White Album 2 story-wise, aka a long-winded love triangle melodrama complete with certain plot twists that complicate the story, including the protagonist kind of getting with both girls at the same time. From what I remember of the anime I watched, it does a decent job going through the main events, mostly focusing on the main trio. The main TV anime eventually has the protagonist Takayuki choose Mitsuki, while the OVA has him end up with the girl he was originally going out with, Haruka. I also remember the anime being very melodramatic, with the main character having a lot of internal conflict over which girl to choose, especially given the circumstances where one girl essentially missed out on a significant period of his life. It was definitely an interesting anime, but the extreme indecisiveness of the main protagonist was really grating at times. Imagining having to go through the same story but in a much longer visual novel form makes me less inclined to read the actual VN. However, as a 14-episode TV anime plus a 4-episode OVA, I remember it being a not half bad watch. Not my favorite romance or drama or anything, but definitely one with unique circumstances that make it stand out. The Kyoto Animation 2006 version of Kanon is generally considered one of the better adaptations, to the point some people say this is a better way to experience the story than the original visual novel for various reasons. That said, while I like this anime enough, I did not like it enough to motivate me to want to read the original visual novel right away, besides maybe seeing what the original Nayuki route was like, since her ending in the visual novel is different from the anime. Outside of that, Kanon is the first key visual novel, and it shows. It has a lot of the templates and frameworks of key heroine melodrama and constant attempts at making you feel emotional. While I think the drama was done fine, I think the actual heroine cast is really hit or miss. I kind of like Nayuki, Sayuri, and Mai, but I did not like the other three main heroines much at all. I think the series relied too much on verbal tics and a bunch of silly, barely explained or outright unexplained plot twists, making me unable to take some of the melodrama seriously. Still, if you're the type of person who likes to experience everything a company made, I do think Kanon in anime form is a decent way to get introduced to how Key tells their stories before going into much longer stories like Clannad or Little Busters. This is probably going to be yet another huge hot take on this list, but I actually kind of like the DS Irae anime adaptation. I like me some cool fights and such, but the main problem I had with the original DS Irae visual novel is that it prided itself too much on ridiculously long paragraphs of monologues during fight scenes, dragging down the pacing. This is on top of the typical issues with fight scenes in visual novels, since they don't use animation, opting for a bunch of still CGs with variations and attempts at moving sprites with sound effects and music to attempt to carry the fights. The animation in the DS Irae anime isn't anything special, but just the fact that we can see the cool Chuni fights with only a minimal amount of the typical Chuni ranting made the pacing a lot better, and similarly sped up the plot in general, which is good for me because I thought DS Irae was way too long. The closest thing I have to a big flaw with DS Irae is that it only covered Marie's route, which was the original true route equivalent of the original version of DS Irae. While the route story content is pretty okay, I think they should have gone with Reia's route, since that one had by far the highest amount of characterization and interesting plot twists. I can understand why they went with this route though, since apparently future light-developed visual novels go off Marie's route. Okay, this is going to be possibly the hottest take in the entire video, but I gotta be real, I do not understand the extreme hate for the Umineko anime. Do I think it's a perfect anime or an outright replacement for the visual novel? Absolutely not. However, I still think, to this day, it has plenty of features that make it stand out as a standalone experience and as a complementary experience to the VN, especially compared to the original version of the VN, which had worse art and no voice acting. As a reminder, this anime is where all the popular voice acting got cast for the eventual PS3 version and other Umineko spin-offs, so this aspect alone makes the Umineko anime noteworthy enough for me. Even though Umineko presents itself as a mystery story, let's be real, half the reason people like it is for the over-the-top shonen-like action with all the magic fights and goofy shenanigans in the meta world. And I'd say, for the most part, that's where the anime shines. In the visual novel, you can have fun with the CGs and sound effects simulating the magic fight scenes, but I personally liked seeing these moments in animated form. I also appreciated being able to get a speedrun version of the slower parts of the visual novel, especially the parts about who gets Kinzo's inheritance in the first arc, or the ridiculously long Anjay flashback in the fourth arc. These slower parts became infinitely more palatable because Ryukishi 07 is infamous for his slow and repetitive build-up in the original visual novel. While I've been defending the Umineko anime, I will admit it is definitely far from perfect and definitely far from a replacement for the visual novel as a whole. First of all, the fact that the answer arcs weren't even attempted to be animated because of how bad the reception of the anime was in Japan was unfortunate. I personally would have loved to see characters like Erika or Delanar in anime form. The most common critique is that due to how quickly and how many details are glossed over in the anime adaptation, it's apparently literally impossible to solve the mystery, while in the original visual novel, it's apparently possible to solve the mystery just through the question arcs alone. That said, I think the anime does the spectacle part of the VN so much better that I don't really care. Not like the original visual novel itself gives you all the answers to the mystery anyway. Finally, Umineko, the visual novel, has a godlike soundtrack, and sadly you only get to hear maybe 30% of it at most in the anime. Apparently, a lot of Western fans consider Air one of the lesser key titles, but more importantly, there are those who read the original Air visual novel and see the anime adaptation as a definite downgrade compared to the VN. For my money, I like the Air anime, but admittedly, a huge part of that is because I loved the last arc. The first 3/4 or so are a little bit hit or miss in terms of interesting character arcs, but otherwise seems to take advantage of its summer setting pretty well. I like that Air is one of the few key visual novels to actually have a ballsy ending, a lot different from the typical key magic. I would say the last arc is arguably the best Nakige story from any key story ever. Sadly, the first 3/4 of the series is just too up and down, and I especially did not particularly care for the flashback arc. I plan on reading the visual novel on Steam to see if it's any better than what I remember from the anime. Okay, now this is going to be yet another hot take, big surprise, but I actually think the anime adaptation of the Grisaia trilogy is not that bad. I will admit, objectively, Season 1 is honestly way too fast compared to how long the original visual novel was, though I personally argue that visual novel was too slow, especially the common route. However, I actually found Season 1 more than perfectly watchable. While it did miss some notable gags from the common route, I actually liked that the common route was basically limited to 3 episodes. You get just enough character introductions, interactions, and comedy to get attached to the characters before the drama starts. Admittedly, I was not a fan of the imbalance in the heroine route episodes. Like, for example, Sachi's route is literally resolved in 1 episode, while Amane's flashback alone takes 3 episodes, and she still gets another episode to resolve her present-day drama. But I think even with the fast episode count, you can still feel the emotional impact. But that's just Season 1. I thought Season 2 was a nice, relatively well-paced way to show Yuji's backstory. Don't have too much to complain about there. I know a lot of people don't like the Eden of Grisaia because it fully gets rid of the psychological, dark, character-focused backstory drama that made the Fruit of Grisaia so popular. But honestly, I think Eden is a weirdly fun time, especially in anime form, where you get to see the over-the-top nature of the heroine's powers and even Yuji's hyper-competence in full force. The Grisaia trilogy is far from my favorite visual novel to anime adaptation, but it was more than serviceable enough for me. I liked that Yuji actually had voice acting, which is deserved with how much personality he has compared to the average visual novel protagonist, and how Season 1 was aired in a way to where the Eden of Grisaia's harem ending actually kind of made sense. This is an adaptation some people might not even aware exists. The first visual novel by Nitro Plus, Phantom of Inferno. Apparently there are 2 different anime adaptations of it, but the one I watched was called Phantom Requiem for the Phantom. This is one of those cases where I refuse to read the original visual novel because the only English translation version we have currently is on a DVD, so the way you have to advance text, make choices, and even save and load is automatic and sounds like a pain in the butt. Thankfully, the anime adaptation seems to have adapted the story of Phantom of Inferno well enough, mostly focusing on the Ein route, I believe. I thought it did a good job of setting the relatively dark tone and setting as expected of Nitro Plus, and thankfully, if there are any typical Nitro Plus rape scenes, they were not shown or implied in the anime. Instead, all we got was a pretty cool action psychological thriller showing the dark pasts of a few characters forced to become assassins. I thought a lot of the side characters were pretty interesting as well. That said, even though I enjoyed the anime for what it was, even I could tell there was a lot of content I was missing out on by not having all the routes available. Hopefully some kind of Phantom of Inferno remake or retranslation comes out on a better engine in VN form eventually. The anime adaptation of F, A Fairy Tale of the Two called A Tale of Memories and Melodies was one of the visual novel adaptations I watched before realizing it was based on a visual novel. That said, I know a lot of people who really like it. It has a really similar Nakige storytelling style to Ki, and some even say the story was better than a lot of Ki anime like Clannad and similar titles. While I would say I overall liked F, I think it was just a bit overhyped. I found every story pretty interesting individually, and I liked the unique concept of constantly switching between different couples. However, I felt the characters weren't as engaging as I was hoping. The only real standout couple to me was Chihiro's because of her memory loss and how it tied into the memories theme of season 1. My favorite overall girl was Mizuki, but that's mainly because I like Genki tomboy characters. I wasn't super into her relationship, since it involved a big age gap, had real little development, plus her male love interest was a bit of a douche. All the other couples and characters were just okay at best to me. Thankfully, there were enough memorable emotional moments and plot twists that made this Nakige anime worth watching. I just didn't love it as much as I was hoping I would. While I can understand the complaints for the DEEN studio adaptation of Fate Stay Night 2006, I think it gets a lot of undeserved hate. Do I think it represents the absolute potential best representation of the Fate route in anime form? Absolutely not. There are many things that could have been done better. However, I still think the way it told the story was more than competent enough. People may not remember this anime was actually popular with anime onlys back in the day, but it's only gotten more criticism from the visual novel community over time, especially when the more popular Ufotable adaptations started coming out. While some people dislike the fact that Shiro doesn't have as much of his inner thoughts shown like in the visual novel, I think his core philosophy is more than shown by how he acts recklessly and how he voices his opinions to other people. Saber's story themes about not being obsessed with the past and her duty was still very well done, and in general, the story beats, at least to me, are done pretty well with only minor things that I feel like they skimmed out too much on. I still think the censorship of changing the threesome H scene with Saber and Rin into a CGI dragon is one of the funniest ways to include H scenes back then when talking about sex was even more controversial than it is today. But as said earlier, there are major flaws that do exist. For example, while the action scenes are passable, they are nowhere near as breathtakingly beautiful as any of the Ufotable adaptations. The attempts to mix in scenes from the Unlimited Blade Works and especially Heaven's Fields routes were nice in theory, given that the company probably wasn't sure if they were going to be able to do the other routes. However, I thought certain scenes like Rin's fight at the beginning with Shiro didn't feel right, and the anime original scene involving Sakura's ties to the plot were some of the weirdest pace breakers of the show. The one with Sakura was particularly noteworthy because they couldn't outright spoil Heaven's Feel, but all the scene did was just maybe give a little bit of character depth to make Sakura kind of important, but ultimately wasn't very satisfying. Having said that, I thoroughly disagree with all the people who leave this particular anime adaptation out of the quote-unquote ideal Fate anime watch order. The Fate route story is still a very much important part of the series, and in my opinion, is better than Fate Zero or Fate Stay Night Unlimited Blade Works as a starting spot to get to know the Holy Grail War and the overall setting of the Fate series. I guess I can quickly talk about the DEEN version of Unlimited Blade Works, but considering it was a whole route crammed into one movie, it was kinda cool to see big moments in movie form at the time, but there's just not much reason to watch it when the Ufotable TV anime version exists. The Summer Pockets anime is an interesting one to talk about as it's yet another title where I've only watched the anime. I did not read the original VN or Reflection Blue yet. Thankfully, unlike the other key anime adaptations so far, the Summer Pockets anime actually does something really interesting. It keeps the romance for all four heroines by doing an omnibus format, something very rare, with only one other title on this list that does that format. I'm well aware that this anime likely cut out a lot of scenes despite only sticking to the original four main heroines, but honestly, outside of maybe Shiraha's route, which probably could have used one more episode to make their romance development more believable, I thought this was a pretty competent adaptation in terms of getting an anime only interested. I know someone who only watches anime, liked Clannad and Angel Beats a lot, and still liked Summer Pockets a lot as well. That said, Summer Pockets isn't higher on this list because, despite arguably having the most modern, best looking presentation of all key title anime adaptations so far, I think the story feels the most predictable and derivative of any route-based key visual novel to date. The Summer Island setting is cool enough, but while there are details changed, you could basically trace major plot twists in Summer Pockets' story to a previous story from Key that was actually written by Jun Maeda. Sure, there were some nice enough character moments, and the true route part was pretty emotional, but honestly, I think Summer Pockets' cast as a whole isn't as funny or memorable as Little Busters, Clannad, Angel Beats, or Rewrite. The slice of life parts also lean a bit too much on repetitive, generic, unfunny, lewd jokes, especially the shirtless bro guy. Still, despite that, I think the Summer Pockets anime is certainly well made and enjoyable, just far from my favorite key story, whether in anime or visual novel form. The Planetarian anime is a really interesting case. The original Planetarian VN was the first short visual novel I ever read all the way back in the early 2010s, and I thought it was okay at best. I just thought, compared to all the other key anime I saw at the time, it was insanely predictable, and while I liked her okay, I had no emotional attachment to Yumemi. Since it was so short, it basically had no depth, so I couldn't get into it. When I watched the anime adaptation movie out of curiosity, I ended up liking it a lot more than the VN, and at first, I wasn't sure why, but now I can think of several reasons. The first is we actually get to see a visual and voice combination of the Junker. Sure, we got a sense of his personality and voice in the VN, but seeing him slowly get his character development with visuals was a lot more cathartic for the message that Planetarian was trying to send. Having Yumemi and her constellation stuff shown properly in anime form also made the experience feel closer to the wow effect that was being intended for the VN. Finally, the movie version specifically has an epilogue that was previously only in a drama CD, and that really tied things up together for me properly. The original ending of the VN was just a bit too open-ended for me to care that much in addition to the short length, but this added epilogue, showing how things were affected in the future, was a much better, emotionally resonant ending for me. Yet another hot take, I am of the firm belief that the Rewrite anime actually isn't too bad, and in fact is generally pretty good as long as you come in with the right expectations. Now obviously, in a perfect world, if it were somehow possible to do a 70-hour VN in like a 50+ episode format similar to Clannad, that would have been great. The problem is, I think it's just literally impossible to mix all the routes together, unlike basically every other route-based key VN adaptation, by making it so the MC helps the girls without romancing most of them. Now, am I saying the Rewrite anime as we have it now is perfect? Absolutely not. But that said, I think Season 1 is generally surprisingly kind of underrated. I think it works as an introduction for an anime only to this world. One of the biggest upsides to this anime, in my opinion, is that Kotaro, one of, if not the best key protagonist, actually having a voice in the anime works great in making his already pretty amusing humor in the Rewrite VN even better in the anime. I also thought the comment out in the original visual novel was just a bit too long, so I'm kind of glad that Season 1 heavily reduced it in a way, even if it came at the cost at losing some of the best jokes from the VN, like the Yoshino song or some of Kotori's best English. Season 1's take on an anime original route at the end was certainly unique. I kinda like to see it if Harvest Festa Kagari had a route in the original VN. In the Harvest Festa VN, Kagari's route had a nice idea, but ultimately, not much could be done with it because of how short it was. Meanwhile, in the anime, I liked how it doubled as a Kagari route, but also as a route where most of the main heroines, besides Aokana, Rip, are all in one place by the end of the route. Now sadly, this did mean that the heroines' backstories were kind of combined into this anime original route, but truncated and without a lot of important details. So while there was some hinted character depth at best, a lot of the time you just had to come to care about the heroines through their humor. Thankfully, Season 2 is a generally surprisingly good adaptation of Moon and Terra, at least to me. I actually consider this portion an upgrade over the original VN Terra route, which was clearly rushed in the sense that there were so many spots of not seeing many actual visuals of characters or CGs, relying too much on NVL narration. I can't say too much else so I don't spoil Rewrite's true ending. All I'll say is I actually like the final ending scene more in the anime than the visual novel as well. There's a lot of minor differences I didn't mention, but overall, as you can tell, I enjoyed this anime. It does help that Rewrite is my favorite key VN, so I'm biased, but I think this anime can be fun for anime-only viewers, or a fun complementary experience to the VN. However, I definitely don't think it outright replaces the VN in any way. I definitely think you should read the VN sometime before or after the anime, just so you can fill in the gaps of missing character development. Little Busters is actually decently rated well on anime rating tracking sites, especially the second season, Refrain. Not in the top echelon of visual novel to anime adaptation scores, but pretty respectable compared to the very low scores of many VN to animes. However, I've definitely seen enough Little Busters VN fans do the typical critique of how the visual novel is so much better and the original source will always be better and all that jazz. As you can tell how my rankings have been so far, on average, I'd say most key visual novel TV adaptations are generally pretty good, averagely watchable at worst. I would say Little Busters is notable for me personally in that it's my favorite key anime adaptation where I've not read the original visual novel at this point, but may do so in the future. That said, personally, I don't understand why the Little Busters anime isn't loved on the same level as Clannad by Kyoto Animation, even by anime onlys. It pretty much follows the exact same format, doing a little bit of the common route, then having a few episodes of the heroine routes before going back to the common route, then doing another heroine route, rinse and repeat until the true route starts in season 2. In my opinion, it seems like the only reason people see this adaptation as okay at best or outright ignore watching it is because it's animated by JC staff instead of Kyoto Animation. And look, I'll agree, Kyoto Animation generally has some of the best looking animation out there, and there's a reason people like them a lot. But I think people give KyoAni a little too much love on the level of simping. JC staff did more than a competent job of making Little Busters enjoyable for an anime only like me. Considering this series is all about friendship, I'm glad that season 1 at least found a way to include the heroine routes where it was relatively easy to remove the romance aspects so that the heroines could always be ready to go back to common route content, with the only exception being Kurugaya in season 2 for obvious reasons. A lot of people criticize season 2's big twists related to Kyosuke and the other bros not being as emotionally impactful just by the way the anime adapts things, but I don't know, I thought it got that emotional stuff just fine. Random hot side take, but I think the key magic revealed at the way end is one of my least favorite key twists, and I highly doubt the VN will change my mind if I get there. But otherwise, JC staff did a competent job showing off the hilarity and wholesomeness of the Little Busters friend group. While I think the heroine route stories themselves were hit or miss, the way they were adapted seemed more than competent enough to how they were in the VN, likely removing a lot of the, in my opinion, unnecessarily slow fluff that plagues a lot of key visual novels. I can already hear the complaints about why this isn't higher or outright number 1, and I'll get to that. But honestly, placing Steins Gate anywhere below the top 10 best anime adaptations of visual novels objectively just isn't accurate unless you truly dislike the story. Thankfully, I do in fact like this story. There's a reason it's one of the highest rated anime on sites like My Anime List, despite most voters clearly having not read the original visual novel. There's also a reason even diehard visual novel fans praise Steins Gate as an example of a genuinely high-quality visual novel to anime adaptation. That said, I admit I have not read the original visual novel myself. But when I see its choice system and its particular art style, hot take, I don't get the praise for the art style that many VN fans seem to have for it. I'm fine just sticking to just watching this anime. For me, this adaptation struck a pretty good balance. It built up slice-of-life interactions while the characters learned about time travel, the microwave, CERN, and all the intricate details. Of course, the second half of the series is what really stands out, with shit hitting the fan and Okabe, the main character, going through compelling, dark drama. The story's twists all come back to his curiosity, and the way the show treats time travel in an interesting, nuanced, and relatively consistent way, rather than relying on contrived plot twists or conveniences, is why Steins Gate gets so much praise for its time travel narrative. Now, as much as I appreciate the show and how it tackles a topic that often gets mishandled, there are several issues that keep Steins Gate from being one of my all-time favorite visual novel anime adaptations, or an anime I wish I could love more. My first big issue is the character cast. I know a lot of people think Okabe and Kurisu are two of the best visual novel characters ever. I'd say they're fairly likable, but outside of Okabe's dramatic arc, I don't really get the love around him. I know his Chunibyo persona is used to shield his real motivations, and personality is the closest thing he has to actual depth, but he doesn't really have much otherwise, and I thought his Chuni jokes were hit or miss as well. Similarly, while I appreciate that Kurisu is actually an intelligent, adult-age character, she just felt more like a helpful, supporting character that shows up sometimes and didn't have a particularly standout personality or development otherwise. As for the rest of the cast, except maybe Suzuho, who was kinda likable, I just didn't really care for anybody else. Mayuri felt really one-dimensional, Daru was a bit cringe, and the repeated Luca gender jokes were tiresome. While the story is compelling and uses science well, I didn't find it as smart or as deep as it's sometimes made out to be. The core structure is good, but it just lacked that extra edge to make Steins Gate truly an all-time great for me, instead just being something I simply enjoyed mostly. The two Fate Stay Night routes animated by Ufotable, Unlimited Blade Works, and Heaven's Feel definitely excel in one thing: God tier animation. That's a big reason Ufotable is considered one of the best anime studios ever, and why the Demon Slayer series continues to be a huge success. Objectively, I'd say Fate UBW and especially Heaven's Feel may not be quite as strong adaptations as Steins Gate when it comes to all the details of the overall story, but in terms of the quality of the actual story and characters, I much prefer them over Steins Gate overall. If you remember earlier, I said that I actually liked the DEEN adaptation of the Fate route. It was a bit dry at times, but I thought it kept the spirit of the series' themes and character development intact, and the action scenes were serviceable. However, the Unlimited Blade Works and Heaven's Feel anime by Ufotable are on a whole other level when it comes to animation and action scenes, making some of the visual novel's most memorable fight scenes even more impactful with their stunning presentation. I also think they covered the main events of both routes well enough, capturing Unlimited Blade Works' themes of heroism, Shiro's struggle to balance his ideals, and his compelling rivalry with Archer. Heaven's Feel is a much darker story, so Ufotable made the smart choice to use a movie trilogy format so they can include certain darker plot relevant scenes. Keep in mind, Fate Stay Night was the first VN I ever read, so I have a lot of nostalgia, so the only real flaws I have is that there were definitely some scenes that felt rushed, which is sadly all too common in adaptations, or were skipped entirely, which would have been nice to see animated. Still, that does not take away from how much fun I had revisiting these two Fate Stay Night routes in anime form, thanks to the spectacularly animated action, great presentation in general, character development, plot twists, and the overall feel of the story. This anime was pretty popular at the time, but it's disappointing how forgotten Amagami SS has become over the years, because I genuinely think it's one of the best romance-heavy visual novel anime adaptations out there. It took an old-school dating sim format with multiple routes and endings, and even if it didn't invent the style, it's still one of the first anime adaptations to take advantage of the super rare omnibus storytelling. Having 6 distinct romance routes in a single season was excellent, and aside from the childhood friend Rihoko, who for some reason did not have a romance ending in season 1, each route had strong, full stories with solid character development. These romance stories aren't really inventing the wheel, but they're succinct, fun, and each heroine having memorable enough personalities keeps you hooked. But if you don't like a certain heroine, just like reading a VN, you could just skip their anime arc and not miss much. Even the protagonist Junichi isn't too bad. He's a decent main character who gets into some silly, perverted situations at times, but overall, the romance between him and each heroine makes sense. I watched a couple people in my Discord stream the original Ebikore Amagami Vita version, and while it does seem like I missed out on certain slice of life events and endings that were not shown in the anime, when I saw how many events you had to deal with just to reach an ending, I was like, yeah, I think I'm fine with just experiencing the anime version. If you're curious on who my favorite girl was, it's pretty easily Tsukasa Ayatsuji because of the reveal of what her true personality is like, making her have the most compelling character development. Though as I said, I like all the main 6 heroines to some degree. That said, for Ayatsuji specifically, I prefer the manga version of her ending. I also have not watched Season 2 since I was pretty satisfied with Season 1 and heard bad things about Season 2. I've seen a lot of mixed opinions about the DEEN adaptation of the first 2 to 3 seasons of Higurashi. Similar to the Umineko anime, certain details tend to be skimmed over, and you get little to none of the characters' introspective narration. However, the Higurashi anime has a few big advantages over Umineko for me. First of all, the plot is much simpler, so it's easier to adapt to anime form. Umineko's mystery was incredibly complex, with a ton of possible culprits, many characters, and countless magical theories and twists, and at least for me had an incredibly flawed ending. Higurashi, by contrast, starts off with a more typical high school slice of life before diving into horror mixed with mystery. I'd say it works well for the anime, though some argue that the horror is exaggerated too much. But from what I've read of the visual novel, the tone isn't that drastically different except for the lack of internal narration. Thanks to the faster pacing, we thankfully got through a lot of the slower, repetitive slice-of-life comedy scenes a lot more quickly, still showing enough to show the quirkiness of the characters before the darker side of the story comes in. I think Higurashi did a good job showing off the Groundhog Day-like scenario with the same repeated days but with slightly different events. And, unlike Umineko, Higurashi actually reveals all the mysteries by the end, making a much more satisfying if less complex ending. The DEEN adaptation covers both the question and answer arcs, as well as the fan disc Irae. I thought the anime did a solid job covering the key points of each season, and I understood the main plot beats well before I knew Higurashi was originally a visual novel. In retrospect, I did think it was weird that Season 1 was actually arcs 1 through 6, while Season 2 was actually arcs 7 and 8 plus a filler arc at the beginning. There are some aspects I wish were in the anime, like more introspection or the meta elements in Episode 8. Otherwise, I really enjoyed Higurashi. It was one of my favorite anime when I was still a very new weeb, with a great mix of horror, mystery, and psychological character development. If you were wondering, Shion is easily my favorite girl from the Higurashi series, but Minagoroshi, aka Arc 7, is my overall favorite arc. I was seriously tempted to put Nukitashi at number 1 because the original visual novel is easily in my top 3 favorite VNs. To this day, I still can't believe Kadokawa and Passione managed to deliver an adaptation that kept the spirit of Nukitashi's outrageous, sex-heavy utopia, which is actually a dystopian island, setting intact, along with the enforcement laws and psychological themes about acceptance, coexistence, and minorities. Thankfully, the Nukitashi anime kept the same humor style as the visual novel, with plenty of sex jokes and hilarious banter between the quirky cast. The anime did something interesting with a sort of original route, using Nanase's story as a base, but mixing in elements from other routes, even borrowing elements from Nukitashi 2 like Susuko and Schubert's design, and Rin's more abrasive personality. It was a lot of fun seeing things like the side characters quote-unquote hooking up in public, and some of the fight scenes animated. The anime did a solid job balancing the comedic tone with the more serious themes, just like the VN. The NLNS group is one of my favorites in any media, with their leader Junosuke showing off his typical incel style comedy, but coming off as much less of a jerk, especially being much nicer to Nanase than he was in the VN. The 5 main heroines get solid characterization whenever they appear. Even the big 3 and FS are handled pretty well when they show up, and by the end of the anime, you really do get a sense of what the VN was aiming for, though it stops just short of revealing every major plot twist, so people can go read the visual novel for the full experience. Unfortunately, the fact that the anime does not tell the whole story is a big reason why I can't put it at number 1, even with how much I loved the adaptation. The anime only has 11 episodes, which is just enough to introduce the characters, lay out the setting, showcase the humor, and tease the series' themes. I loved what was there, but there were many points where I found myself wishing for all the extra elements missing from the VN. For example, the character bender was a lot more limited in the anime compared to the VN, where there were plenty of slice of life scenes with the NLNS just hanging out, making fun of each other, and revealing their bonds. In the anime, Fumino and Misaki join relatively late, so there's less time for their bonds to develop. But I even wish Hinami and Asane could have had a little bit more screen time in general. Even though Junosuke being less of a jerk was nice, there were elements of his character arc in Nukitashi 1 that felt missing, like his slower acceptance that the FS were not nearly as bad as he thought, which didn't have the same build-up in the anime. We barely saw Hitora, one of the major antagonists, and the secret old man benefactor was majorly sidelined, though he could have been the main villain for season 2 if it ever gets made. If this Nukitashi anime had double the episodes, it could have easily been my number 1 favorite anime adaptation. Even if it stuck to an anime original route, just adding more episodes would have let them expand on a lot of the smaller elements I wish they included from the VN. So despite loving the anime in general, I can't put it at number 1 in good conscience. While Steins Gate tends to be the most highly rated visual novel anime adaptation, at least according to tracking sites like MyAnimeList, there's one other title universally considered one of the best, Key's arguably most famous work, Clannad. Similar to Kanon 2006, there are fans who genuinely believe the anime version of Clannad is better than the original visual novel, even with all the cuts. Realistically, with the sheer amount of routes and amount of content in the original Clannad visual novel, and with the way the story was adapted into the anime, there was no way they could fit everything from the visual novel in, even with the 50-episode budget. Thankfully, Kyoto Animation did an outstanding job, and the way they adapted Clannad is a huge reason the studio became so renowned. A big thing worth talking about is the protagonist, Tomoya Okazaki. While he isn't my favorite key protagonist, having Tomoya show on screen with a voice actor is already a huge upgrade over the visual novel. Sure, you missed some of his witty, angsty internal monologue from the VN, but seeing him interact with others with clear visuals makes his reactions and development notable enough to me. Another major strength is how the anime handles the non-main heroines, aka the ones that aren't Nagisa. Kyoto Animation popularized a visual novel adaptation approach of adapting all the major routes but having the protag only pursuing romance with the true heroine, perfecting it in Clannad. Tomoya goes through most of the significant heroine route stories in seasons 1 and 2 without romance before finally committing to Nagisa partway into season 2. A few routes like Tomoyo and Kyo's needed to be OVA episodes because they require romance to work, but the characters themselves are still present throughout the main anime. Personally, I didn't care all that much for these routes in the VN, so I'm fine with them being shorter OVAs. The adaptation choice to have Tomoya naturally help others in one story without romance works on multiple levels. It shows that while he can be sarcastic and a bit of a troll, he's ultimately a good-hearted person. Watching him support the side cast while slowly getting closer to Nagisa was a great adaptation choice. Speaking of Nagisa, unlike the Clannad movie, which changed her personality into an overly perfect angelic figure for Tomoya, the anime shows her real flaws, her shyness, and secretly her selfish side. Her development alongside Tomoya's is a great complementary story, and the relationship is integrated into the overall story in a way few adaptations have even tried. If I didn't know Clannad was based on a visual novel, I could easily believe it was an original anime with how smoothly everything fits together, including anime-only scenes like Kyo and Ryo crying when they realized they lost to Nagisa late in season 1. I've mostly been discussing season 1, but season 2, aka After Story, is undeniably the most memorable part of Clannad. It was once in the top 10 highest rated anime ever, and is still among the highest rated visual novel adaptations on MyAnimeList. The way it handles Tomoya's family struggles, Mixing relatable real-life issues with Keyes' emotional Nakige drama writing style is incredibly powerful. Even without having a family of my own, the show hit particularly hard with very relatable dramatic moments. That said, the Clannad anime isn't perfect. Some routes aren't in the anime at all, like Kappei's, which is a shame since its themes could have fit well and given Ryo a happier ending. Also, while it's not my least favorite key magic, I've never liked the light orbs and their connection to solving the true ending. They are explained in the VN, albeit not very well, and in the anime it's even less clear. The orbs show up occasionally without much explanation, so the role in the ending feels arbitrary and underdeveloped. But as I said, I almost never like key magic Deus Ex Machinas anyway, whether in the VNs or animes. Still, aside from these nitpicks, Clannad is hands down my favorite visual novel to anime adaptation. The humor is funny enough and the emotional moments are strong. The anime covers the majority of the visual novel's best storylines, brings Tomoya to life as a protagonist, and adapts the true route with faithfulness and heart. It's one of the few visual novel to anime adaptations to get a full 50 episodes, something most longer VNs wish had anime adaptations even close to that episode count. If I had to recommend only one visual novel to anime adaptation to watch, it would absolutely be Clannad, for very good reason, especially if you're into emotional drama stories. By the way, if you want to know the exact differences between the visual novel and the KyoAni anime adaptation of Clannad, I'd recommend watching Red Pin 6's channel, cause he goes into some really good detail on various comparison videos. And that covers the extremely long list of me ranking every visual novel to anime adaptation I've ever watched. There are likely at least a handful of opinions you heavily disagree with, but the fact of the matter is, well, all visual novel to anime adaptations are for the most part imperfect. But as you may have noticed, I've at least kind of liked most VN adaptations I've tried. I still think anime adaptations of VNs are important for getting people to potentially get into the visual novel medium, or at the very least, help them experience stories they otherwise wouldn't if they just stuck to anime and maybe manga and light novels. What are your thoughts on the opinions that I have on the visual novel to anime adaptation titles that I talked about in this video? Feel free to leave a comment below.